Sometimes life strips away everything you thought you were, leaving you with nothing but the choice to surrender or transform. When a woman loses her family, her name, and her place in the world, she discovers that even emperors can be desperate men. Selvera sat in the rain beneath a temple wall, cast out by her own kin for a scandal not of her making. Emperor Hadrianus found her there, this powerful ruler of Rome who controlled legions but couldn't control his own fate. He knelt in the mud beside her and made an offer that would change both their lives. You need a home, and I need an heir. It wasn't love or charity, it was survival. She could step into his marble palace as both his salvation and his secret, or disappear forever into the streets. But what happens when a desperate emperor and a broken woman discover they need each other more than they ever imagined? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The rain had begun 3 days before Selvera's world collapsed entirely, as if the gods themselves wept for what was to come. She had awakened that morning in silken sheets, her hair braided with golden thread, her father's voice drifting up from the courtyard below as he discussed grain shipments with the steward. By evening, those same sheets lay torn and bloodied, the golden thread scattered across marble floors like fallen stars. And her father's voice had been silenced forever. The scandal that destroyed House Valeria came swiftly, as scandals often do among Rome's elite. Accusations of treason whispered first in shadowed alcoves, then shouted in the forum, documents bearing her father's seal, promising grain stores to barbarian tribes beyond the Rhine, gold found hidden in walls that her father swore he had never seen. Witnesses who emerged from nowhere, their testimonies perfectly aligned, their eyes never quite meeting hers when they spoke. Selvera had known it was a lie from the first whispered word. Her father, Marcus Valerius Maximus, had served Rome for 30 years, had bled for her on a dozen battlefields, had worn the scars of German spears and Gallic arrows like badges of honor. But lies, when spoken loudly enough and often enough, become their own truth. Within a fortnight, her father was dead by his own sword, rather than face the executioner's block. Her mother had fled to distant relatives who pretended not to know her name, and Selvera found herself cast out with nothing but the clothes on her back and the terrible knowledge that someone had orchestrated their destruction with surgical precision. The streets of Rome had no mercy for fallen nobility. The same merchants who once bowed when she passed now spat at her feet. Former friends crossed to the other side of narrow alleyways, their faces turned away as if her disgrace might be contagious. She sold her jewelry first, then her fine clothes, then finally even the simple wooden comb that had been her grandmother's, keeping only enough coin to buy coarse bread and a tattered cloak that smelled of its previous owner's poverty. 3 months she survived this way, growing thinner and more desperate with each passing day. She slept in doorways when the weather was kind, huddled in the shadows of temples when it was not. The rain-soaked steps of the Temple of Fortuna became her refuge on the worst nights, when the cold bit deep enough to make her wonder if her father had chosen the easier path after all. It was there, on such a night, that Emperor Hadrianus Solon found her. But to understand why the most powerful man in the world would kneel in mud beside a disgraced woman, one must first understand the weight that pressed upon his shoulders, like Atlas bearing the heavens. Hadrianus had worn the purple for 7 years, each one harder than the last. He had taken the throne at 35, strong and confident, certain that his will alone could bend the empire to his vision. At 42, silver touched his temples, and lines mapped the corners of his eyes, not from laughter, but from the endless calculations required to keep an empire from tearing itself apart. The Senate tolerated him because he kept the peace and the gold flowing. The armies loved him because he had been one of them, had earned his first command through merit rather than birth, had shared their bread and their blood on campaigns from Britannia to the Euphrates. The people respected him because he built roads and aqueducts, kept grain flowing to the markets, and his taxes were no heavier than necessary. But none of this solved his greatest problem. He had no heir. 2 wives had preceded his current unmarried state. The first, a political match arranged by his predecessor, had died in childbirth, along with what would have been his son. The second, chosen for love rather than politics, had given him 5 years of happiness and 3 miscarriages before fever took her in the winter of his 4th year as emperor. Since then, he had resisted all pressure to remarry, claiming he needed time to grieve. In truth, the thought of watching another woman die trying to give him the child Rome demanded filled him with a dread deeper than any battlefield had ever inspired. Yet time was not his ally. Whispers already began in the Senate about succession, about distant cousins with tenuous claims, about generals whose loyalty might waver if the imperial line remained uncertain. His closest advisor, Lucius Quintus Torquatus, brought him reports each morning that made the situation clearer with brutal precision. "The Germanic tribes mass again beyond the Rhine," Torquatus had said just that morning, his weathered face grave as he spread scrolls across the emperor's private study. The room was simple by imperial standards, a desk of dark wood, shelves lined with military manuals and philosophical treatises, a single window that looked out over the Circus Maximus, where crowds would soon gather for the afternoon races. "They sense weakness in our succession crisis. Let them sense what they will," Hadrianus had replied, though his voice carried less conviction than his words. "Our legions remain strong. Legions follow eagles, Caesar. But eagles follow the man who holds them." Torquatus moved to pour wine from a simple clay amphora, another sign of Hadrianus's rejection of excessive luxury. "Senator Gaius Flavius has been hosting more dinner parties lately. Always the same guests. Men who command eastern provinces, men who control grain shipments." Hadrianus accepted the wine, but did not drink. The goblet was silver, unadorned except for a dent near the rim, where it had once deflected a Pictish blade meant for his skull. "Flavius has always been ambitious. Ambition with opportunity becomes conspiracy, Caesar. He has 3 sons of marriageable age and enough gold to buy loyalty from those whose honor proves flexible." The emperor set down his wine and moved to the window. Below, vendors called their wares while citizens hurried through streets still slick from morning rain. Ordinary people living ordinary lives, unaware that their fate might hang on one man's ability to produce an heir. "What would you have me do, old friend? Take a 3rd wife and watch her die as the others did?" "I would have you secure the throne you earned," Torquatus said quietly. "However that might require." The weight of that conversation had followed Hadrianus through the day, through meetings with grain merchants and reports from provincial governors, through the evening meal he took alone in his private chambers while rain drummed against marble walls. Restlessness drove him from his bed near midnight, sent him walking the corridors of the palace with only a single guard, a liberty his. Security detail endured, but never approved. It was during this restless wandering that he heard them, voices in the shadows of the eastern wing, where few had reason to venture after dark. Must be soon, before he finds another wife. The Germanic campaign could provide opportunity. 3 accidents, properly arranged. Hadrianus pressed himself against cold stone, every instinct sharpened by years of military command. The voices belonged to men he knew, Flavius himself, Marcus Brutus Calvus the younger, and Titus Cornelius Maximus, senators all, men who dined at his table and smiled when they caught his eye across the forum. "The eastern legions will follow gold as readily as eagles," came Flavius's voice, smooth as oil on water. "Especially if that gold comes with promises of a return to the old ways. And if it fails?" Calvus asked. "Then we fall on our swords like honorable Romans," Flavius replied. "But it will not fail. He has grown soft in his grief, predictable in his roots. 3 days hence, when he visits the Temple of Mars before the Germanic campaign, the crowd will provide all the cover we need." Hadrianus had heard enough. He retreated as silently as he had approached, his mind already calculating responses, weighing options, planning counter-moves. But as he walked through corridors lined with busts of emperors past, their marble eyes seeming to judge his fitness for the purple he wore, one thought rang louder than all others. Even if he survived the assassination attempt, the fundamental problem remained. Without an heir, he was always one blade thrust away from civil war. The irony was not lost on him that his solution would come from the streets where desperate people made desperate choices. Rain still fell as he dismissed his guard and walked alone through the palace gardens, past fountains that caught moonlight like scattered diamonds, past olive trees planted by Augustus himself. The main gates were barred for the night, but he knew other ways, passages used by servants and slaves, routes that led to the city beyond imperial walls. He found her exactly as the fates intended, broken but not beaten, desperate but still proud, her dark hair plastered against her skull by rain that seemed determined to wash away what remained of her former life. Even in her degraded state, something about her bearing spoke of nobility, not the purchased kind that came with gold and favorable marriages, but the earned kind that came from meeting catastrophe with dignity and tact. When their eyes met across that rain-soaked courtyard, both recognized something familiar in the other, the look of someone who had lost everything that mattered and found the strength to continue anyway. "You're shivering," he had said, "kneeling where emperors never knelt, as are you." "Caesar," she had replied, and in that moment he knew she was the answer to prayers. He had been afraid to voice the signet ring on his finger, heavy gold carved with the eagle of imperial authority, caught what little light filtered through storm clouds as he made his offer. Not a command despite his power to compel, not charity despite her obvious need, but partnership forged in mutual desperation and sealed with words that would reshape both their destinies. "You need a home, and I need an heir." The blade meant for Hadrianus's heart instead found the wooden post beside his head, the assassin's aim thrown off by a beggar woman's desperate shove. In the chaos that followed, screams echoing off temple walls, the clash of steel as Praetorian guards rushed forward, the wet sound of blood on marble. Selvera found herself pressed against the emperor's chest, his arms forming a shield around her trembling form. 3 days had passed since their whispered conversation in the rain, 3 days during which she had been given clean clothes, a warm bed in the servants' quarters, and careful instructions about what would be expected of her. She was to be presented as a distant cousin from Gaul, recently arrived and seeking the emperor's protection after her family's tragic death in a barbarian raid. The story was simple enough to be believable, tragic enough to explain her circumstances, and vague enough to discourage detailed questions. But on this morning, as dawn painted the forum in shades of gold and amber, the carefully laid plans dissolved in an instant of violence that changed everything. Hadrianus had insisted on visiting the Temple of Mars before departing for the Germanic campaign. Despite Torquatus's barely concealed anxiety, it was tradition, he argued. No emperor led legions to war without seeking the war god's blessing. Selvera had accompanied him as part of her gradual introduction to court life, walking 3 respectful steps behind, as befitted her supposed station. The attack came as they climbed the temple steps, when the emperor paused to acknowledge the crowd that had gathered to wish him victory. She had been watching the faces, still amazed by the reverence ordinary Romans showed their leader, when movement in her peripheral vision caught her attention. A man in a craftsman's tunic, his hand moving too quickly toward something concealed beneath the leather, training from her noble upbringing lessons in recognizing danger at court functions where politics and violence danced as closely as lovers, made her react without conscious thought. She threw herself forward, her shoulder catching the assassin's arm just as steel cleared leather. The blade that should have pierced imperial flesh instead bit deep into seasoned wood. "Down!" Hadrianus roared, pulling her beneath him as his guards descended on the would-be killer like wolves on wounded prey. But even as blades found their target, and the assassin's blood mixed with morning dew on marble steps, Selvera's eyes were already scanning the crowd, looking for the tells her father had taught her to recognize. "There," she gasped, pointing toward a figure in senatorial stripes who was backing away too carefully, his movements deliberate rather than panicked. And there, her finger found another man whose hand rested on a dagger hilt, whose eyes tracked the guards' positions with military precision. The Praetorians moved like the professional killers they were, surrounding the secondary threats before they could disappear into the crowd or complete whatever backup plan they might have prepared. Within moments, 3 more conspirators were in custody, their carefully planned assassination reduced to chaos and failure. But it was the dagger itself that provided the most damning evidence. The weapon was no common street blade or soldier's standard issue. This was a nobleman's weapon, its hilt worked in silver and set with a small sapphire that caught the morning light. More telling still were the initials etched near the crossguard, GFC Gaius Flavius Calvus. "Careless," Hadrianus murmured as he examined the blade, his voice carrying the calm tone of a man who had faced death too many times to be rattled by one more attempt. Or perhaps arrogant. Flavius always did believe his own rhetoric about destiny. They returned to the palace under heavy guard, the planned temple ceremony postponed indefinitely. In the emperor's private study, with Torquatus standing sentinel and the doors barred against all intrusion, the full scope of the conspiracy began to emerge. "The Germanic campaign was meant to be your funeral pyre," Torquatus said grimly, spreading documents across the desk with hands that shook slightly, not from fear, but from rage, carefully held in check. "Word would have reached the Eastern legions that you fell to barbarian blades." Flavius had ships waiting to carry news of his reluctant assumption of imperial responsibilities. Selvera sat quietly in a chair beside the window, still wearing the simple blue stola that was now torn and stained with an assassin's blood. She had been silent since the attack, her mind processing implications and connections with the clarity that desperate circumstances often provide. "They destroyed my family for this," she said suddenly, her voice cutting through the men's discussion like a blade through silk. Both emperor and advisor turned toward her, recognizing the tone of someone who had just seen the full shape of a pattern that had been hidden in shadows. "Explain," Hadrianus said quietly. She rose and moved to the desk, her finger tracing connections across the scattered papers as if following threads in a tapestry. "My father's supposed treason, grain shipments to Germanic tribes. Who benefits if those same tribes are strengthened just before you lead a campaign against them? Who gains if Rome's greatest military commander dies in a battle that should have been easily won?" "Flavius," Torquatus breathed. "He armed your enemies and destroyed your family to clear his path to power." "More than that," Selvera continued, her analytical mind, trained by years of watching court politics from her father's side, laying bare the conspiracy's full scope. "They needed you to appear weak, isolated, without reliable allies. A man without an heir has no dynasty to protect, no legacy beyond his own life. They made you vulnerable by ensuring you remained alone." The silence that followed was heavy with understanding. Hadrianus moved to stand beside her, looking down at the evidence of a plot that had been years in the making. His enemies had been far more thorough than he had imagined, far more patient than he had given them credit for, which means, he said slowly, that our arrangement threatens more than just their immediate plans. "If you bear my child, you destroy years of careful preparation. They'll try again," she said with certainty, "and next time they'll come for both of us." It was then that something shifted between them, some fundamental change in the nature of their relationship. What had begun as a transaction born of mutual need became something deeper, a partnership forged in shared danger and sealed with spilled blood. "Then we'll have to be ready," Hadrianus said, his hand finding hers where it rested on the desk. His fingers were calloused from sword work, marked with small scars from a lifetime of violence, yet gentle as they closed around hers. Both of us. For the first time since her father's death, Selvera felt something other than despair take root in her chest. Not hope, that seemed too fragile a thing for their circumstances, but determination, purpose, the same steel that had carried her through 3 months. On the streets now forged itself into something sharper, more dangerous. "What would you have me do?" she asked. "Learn," he replied. "Everything. Politics, protocol, the names and faces of everyone who matters in Rome. Learn to recognize enemies before they show their blades, allies before they prove their worth. Learn to be an empress, and if I fail..." For the first time since she had known him, Hadrianus smiled, not the careful, measured expression he wore for public consumption, but something genuine and warm that reached his eyes. "You saved my life today with quick thinking and courage. You unraveled a conspiracy that my most trusted advisors missed. You've already proven you won't fail." Outside the window, Rome continued its daily rhythm. Merchants hawking wares, children playing in narrow streets, citizens going about their lives unaware that their empire's fate might rest on the shoulders of a woman who had been sleeping in temple doorways just days before. But inside that study, as afternoon light slanted through marble columns and painted everything in shades of gold, a pact was being forged that would reshape the empire's destiny. Not just the practical arrangement they had agreed to in the reign, but something more profound, a recognition that they were stronger together than either could be alone. The bloody dagger lay between them on the desk, its sapphire catching the light like a captured star, evidence of betrayal, but also proof that they had survived their first test together. It would not be their last. The wooden comb felt strange in hands that had grown accustomed to rougher textures, coarse bread, cold stone, the threadbare fabric of a beggar's cloak. Selvera turned it over slowly, examining the intricate pattern carved along its spine, a design of intertwining vines that her grandmother had traced with gentle fingers during countless childhood evenings. "Where did you find this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Torquatus cleared his throat, suddenly looking older than his 57 years. "I had my people search the markets after you mentioned it. Cost me 3 denarii to buy it back from a merchant who claimed he'd acquired it honestly." She closed her eyes, feeling the weight of this small kindness. In the 5 days since the assassination attempt, the palace had become her world, a world of marble corridors and whispered conversations, of servants who bowed respectfully but watched her with curious eyes, of constant lessons in deportment and protocol. But this simple piece of carved wood represented something more precious than all the silk and gold they had draped her in. It was proof that her past had not been entirely erased. "Thank you," she said, and meant it more deeply than the words could convey. The quarters they had given her were in the eastern wing of the palace, 3 rooms connected by a private corridor that allowed movement without exposure to the main thoroughfares, where senators and their wives might encounter her too soon. The chambers were modest by imperial standards, but luxurious beyond anything she had known in recent months. A sleeping alcove with a bed soft enough to swallow her completely, a sitting room with windows that overlooked a private garden, and a small study where scrolls and wax tablets waited for her daily lessons. "The Emperor wishes to see you in an hour," Torquatus continued, settling into the chair across from her with the weary air of a man who had aged years in the past week. "Your first lesson in court. Your presentation." Selvera set the comb carefully on the table between them and reached for the scroll he had brought. "Today's lesson in recognizing the subtle hierarchy of Roman nobility. How many people know the truth about our arrangement?" 3. Myself, Hadrianus, and Gaius Marcellus, the palace physician who will need to confirm any pregnancy when the time comes. Everyone else believes the story we've constructed." He paused, studying her face. "Does that trouble you? Living a lie, you mean?" She considered the question seriously. "I've been living one version or another since my father's death. At least this lie serves a purpose beyond mere survival. The past 5 days had been a careful dance of transformation. Each morning brought new lessons, how to walk with the measured grace expected of an imperial consort, how to hold her hands when seated so that rings caught the light properly, how to modulate her voice so that it carried authority without seeming shrill. Afternoons were devoted to Roman history and politics, learning the intricate web of alliances and enmities that governed the Senate, memorizing the names and faces of people who would judge her fitness for the role she was meant to play. But it was the evenings that challenged her most, when Hadrianus would arrive after his daily responsibilities, and they would attempt to navigate the strange intimacy their situation demanded. "You're holding your shoulders too," stiffly, he had observed the night before, as they shared a simple meal in her sitting room. "Nobility is supposed to appear effortless. Easy enough to say when you've never had to learn it in a week," she had replied, then caught herself. "Forgive me. I didn't mean—" "Don't," he had interrupted, his voice gentle but firm. "Don't apologize for speaking honestly. If this arrangement is to work, we need truth between us, at least when we're alone." That conversation had marked a subtle shift in their interactions. The careful formality that had characterized their first days together began to give way to something more natural, though still tentative. She found herself looking forward to these evening visits, not just because they represented a break from the day's lessons, but because they offered glimpses of the man behind the imperial mask. "Tell me about your childhood," she had asked 2 nights ago, surprising herself with the boldness of the question. He had been quiet for a long moment, staring into the wine cup that had become his evening ritual. "I was the 3rd son of a minor patrician family. My father owned olive groves in Latium, prosperous enough, but hardly wealthy by Roman standards. When I was 12, barbarian raids destroyed most of the harvest. My father sold his youngest son's service to a centurion who needed a servant boy. You were a slave? Officially an indentured servant. The distinction mattered to my father's pride, if not to my daily reality. His smile had held no bitterness, only the acceptance of a man who had made peace with his past. The centurion was a hard man but fair. He taught me to read and fight, and when I proved useful, he recommended me for the legions when I came of age. And your family? Dead, mostly. Plague took my parents and eldest brother the year I made centurion. My middle brother has a small farm in Umbria. We exchange letters occasionally, but we've become strangers to each other. Success changes a man as surely as failure does. The honesty of that confession had created space for her own stories. She found herself telling him about her father's campaigns, about the evening meals where military strategy was discussed alongside poetry, about her mother's gentle lessons in managing a household that existed as much for political entertaining as for family comfort. "You miss it," he had observed. "The life, yes. The people who destroyed it for their own purposes, no." She had met his eyes then, seeing understanding there. "We both know what it means to be remade by circumstances beyond our control." Now, as she prepared for another evening of careful conversation and tentative trust-building, Selvera reflected on how strange it felt to be known again. For months, she had been invisible, just another face in Rome's crowds, another beggar to be ignored or scorned. But Hadrianus listened when she spoke, asked questions that showed he was paying attention, remembered details from previous conversations. It was dangerously easy to forget that their growing comfort with each other was built on necessity rather than choice. The servant who came to escort her to the emperor's private dining chamber was new. Young woman named Claudia, who had been assigned as her personal attendant. Unlike the older servants who maintained careful professional distance, Claudia seemed genuinely curious about her mysterious charge. "The cooks prepared your favorite tonight," she said, as they walked through corridors lit by oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on marble walls. "The emperor remembered you mentioning honey cakes." "He remembers everything," Selvera replied, and realized it was true. Hadrianus possessed the kind of detailed memory that made for successful military commanders and dangerous enemies. "Is it true you saved his life?" Claudia asked, then immediately looked embarrassed by her boldness. "Forgive me, Domina. The servants talk, and I know they shouldn't, but—" "Yes," Selvera said simply. I did. Then you're a hero. The words followed her as they reached the dining chamber where Hadrianus waited, dressed in a simple white tunic that made him look younger than his 42 years. A hero. It was strange to think of herself that way, when most days she still felt like a woman clinging to the edges of respectability by her fingernails. But perhaps, she thought as he smiled in greeting, that was exactly what heroes were, ordinary people who refused to let circumstances destroy them completely. "Good evening," he said, rising as she entered. "I hope you're ready for tonight's lesson. We're going to practice being comfortable with each other in public, and how does one practice that?" His smile became something warmer, more genuine. Very carefully, and with a great deal of wine. The fertility amulet was older than Rome itself, carved from green jasper by Etruscan hands in an age when the 7 hills were nothing more than scattered settlements along the Tiber. It had been given to her that morning by Livia Marcella, the emperor's sister, with words that carried both blessing and warning. "This belonged to our grandmother," Livia had said, pressing the small carved figure into Selvera's palm. "She bore 7 children, 5 of whom lived to adulthood. The women in our family have always been fortunate in such matters." The weight of expectation in those words was heavier than the jasper itself. Today marked Selvera's first public appearance as the emperor's acknowledged companion, not yet announced as consort, but present at his side during the Feast of Minerva, where Rome's elite would gather to honor the goddess of wisdom. It was a careful choice of debut, a religious ceremony where her presence could be attributed to piety rather than politics, where any children born of their union might be seen as blessed by divine wisdom. "You look beautiful," Hadrianus said quietly as they prepared to enter the great hall where hundreds of guests awaited. His own nervousness showed only in the way his hand repeatedly checked the ceremonial dagger at his side, an old soldier's habit when facing uncertainty. Selvera's reflection in the polished bronze mirror showed a woman transformed. The deep blue stola, woven with threads of real gold, brought out the darkness of her eyes. Her hair was arranged in the complex style favored by imperial women, secured with pins of ivory and silver. Cosmetics applied by skilled hands had erased the last traces of her time on the streets, painting her face with the pale perfection that Roman society demanded of its noble women. But beneath the finery, the amulet rested against her skin like a promise, or perhaps a burden. "Remember," Torquatus murmured as they took their positions, "curiosity is natural, but answer no direct questions about your family or your past. If pressed, defer to the emperor with appropriate modesty." The doors opened, and they entered together into a world of calculated gazes and measured words. The great hall of the palace had been transformed for the occasion. Columns wreathed in olive branches supported a ceiling painted with scenes of Minerva's victories, while hundreds of oil lamps cast a warm glow over tables laden with delicacies from across the empire. Peacock and boar, honeyed wine from Greece, exotic fruits from Africa, a display of abundance designed to remind all present of Rome's vast reach and limitless power. "Caesar," came the voice of Senator Marcus Crassus, one of the more moderate members of the nobility. "We are honored by your presence at this celebration, and I am honored to share it with Rome's finest citizens," Hadrianus replied, his public voice carrying the perfect balance of authority and accessibility. "May I present my companion, Selvera of the House of Valerius, recently arrived from Gaul." The introductions that followed were a careful dance of social hierarchy. Each senator, each wealthy merchant, each military commander was presented in turn, their reactions providing a map of political allegiances. Some greeted her with genuine warmth, particularly the older women who remembered her father with fondness. Others offered the kind of polite acknowledgement that concealed profound reservation. A few, notably the younger wives of ambitious men, barely concealed their hostility behind painted smiles. "Valerius," mused Julia Tertia, wife of Senator Gaius Brutus. "Was your father perhaps related to Marcus Valerius Maximus?" Such a tragic end to a distinguished family. The words landed like a blade between the ribs, perfectly aimed to draw blood while maintaining the appearance of innocent conversation. Selvera felt Hadrianus tense beside her, but forced herself to remain calm. "Distant cousins only," she replied smoothly. "My branch of the family has long resided in Gaul, which perhaps spared us the worst of Rome's political turmoil." "How fortunate for you," Julia replied, her tone suggesting anything but fortune, but it was the reaction of the younger senators that concerned her most. Men like Lucius Flavius, son of the conspirator they had uncovered, watched her with calculating eyes, measuring her potential threat to their own ambitions. Their wives clustered around them like colorful birds, their conversation too quiet to overhear, but their glances sharp enough to cut. The evening's entertainment provided temporary respite from the social warfare. Poets recited verses in honor of Minerva's wisdom, while dancers performed elaborate routines that told the stories of the goddess's victories over ignorance and chaos. During one particularly complex performance, Hadrianus leaned close enough for his breath to warm her ear. "You're handling this beautifully," he murmured, "but I can see the strain in your shoulders." "I feel like a gladiator in the arena," she admitted quietly. "Except the lions wear silk and speak in riddles." His low chuckle drew curious glances from nearby guests. "An apt comparison, but remember, you're not just defending yourself. You're claiming your place here." The truth of that struck her as the evening progressed. Each conversation, each carefully modulated response, each gracious acknowledgement of a slight was indeed a form of claiming. Not through aggression or confrontation, but through the quiet demonstration of her fitness for the role circumstances had thrust upon her. The real test came during the ritual offering to Minerva herself. As the emperor's companion, Selvera was expected to participate in the ceremony, to speak words of prayer and pour wine upon the altar. It was a moment when any false note, any sign of unworthiness, would be noted by every observer. Standing before the goddess's statue, carved marble painted in lifelike colors, wise eyes seeming to look directly into her soul, Selvera felt the weight of all those watching gazes. The words of the prayer came easily enough. She had memorized them carefully during her lessons. But as she lifted the ceremonial cup, something unexpected happened. The formal phrases gave way to something more personal, more heartfelt. She found herself speaking not just the required words, but adding her own, a prayer for wisdom to navigate the challenges ahead, for strength to prove worthy of the trust placed in her, for the blessing of new life that might secure peace for Rome. When she finished and turned back to face the assembled crowd, she saw something different in their expressions. Not acceptance, that would take time and proof, but a kind of cautious respect. She had not merely performed the ritual, she had invested it with genuine feeling, demonstrated that her connection to Roman traditions ran deeper than political expedience. "Well done," Hadrianus said quietly as they moved through the receiving line that formed after the ceremony. "You surprised them." "I surprised myself," she admitted. "For a moment standing there, I actually felt like I belonged." "You do belong," he said, and the conviction in his voice made her believe it might be true. Later that night, in the privacy of her chambers, Selvera carefully removed the golden pins from her hair and changed from silk back to simple linen. But she left the amulet around her neck, its ancient weight a reminder of the hopes now resting on her shoulders. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of her worthiness. But tonight, for the first time since her father's death, she felt like more than just a survivor. She felt like a woman with a future to build. The military campaign map spread across Hadrianus's desk like a spider's web of red lines and crossed swords, each mark representing a decision that could save or doom thousands of Roman lives. Germanic tribes had indeed massed beyond the Rhine, just as the conspirators had planned. And now the emperor faced the bitter irony of fighting a war his enemies had engineered for his destruction. 30,000 warriors. "Possibly more," reported General Marcus Aurelius Corvus, his weathered face grim in the lamplight. The Cherushi have united with the Chatti and the Swabi, tribes that have been blood enemies for generations. Someone provided them with gold enough to overcome old hatreds. Selvera stood beside the window, officially present only to serve wine and maintain the domestic illusion that this was merely an evening meal with friends. In reality, her sharp mind absorbed every detail of the strategic discussion, noting connections and implications that the men sometimes missed in their focus on tactical considerations. "How long can we delay departure?" Hadrianus asked, his finger tracing supply routes along the map's edge. "Not long," Torquatus replied. "Every day we wait allows them to strengthen their positions. But more importantly, every day we delay gives our enemies in the Senate more time to spread rumors about imperial weakness." The political calculation was as complex as the military one. Hadrianus needed to demonstrate strength and competence to maintain his position, but the campaign itself was a trap designed to eliminate him. Yet refusing to fight would be seen as cowardice, potentially triggering the very civil war they sought to prevent. "There's another consideration," Selvera said quietly, causing all three men to turn toward her. She had learned to time her contributions carefully, speaking only when she could add genuine value to their discussions. "If you lead the legions personally, as tradition demands, what happens here in your absence?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the oil lamps. They all knew the answer. With the emperor away, Selvera would become the most visible symbol of imperial continuity in Rome itself. Every faction, every ambitious senator, every whispered conspiracy would focus on her as either an opportunity or a threat. "She's right," Corvus admitted reluctantly. "Leaving her here unprotected would be like hanging fresh meat in a den of wolves." "Then I'll have protection," Selvera said, moving away from the window to join them at the table. "But more than that, I'll have purpose. The Senate needs to see that imperial business continues smoothly in your absence. Let me represent you in the small matters, receiving petitions, overseeing public works, maintaining the daily ceremonies that keep the people content." Hadrianus studied her face carefully. "That's not what we agreed to. You were meant to be my consort, not my regent. Circumstances change," she replied, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was proposing. "If I'm to bear your heir, that child will need more than just imperial blood. They'll need a mother who understands how to wield power responsibly." The truth of it was undeniable, even if the risk made them all uncomfortable. For the next hour, they refined the plan that would govern Rome in the emperor's absence. Selvera would hold morning audiences in the smaller reception hall, handling routine administrative matters under the guidance of a council of trusted advisors. She would preside over religious ceremonies, ensuring that the gods received proper honor and the people saw imperial presence maintained. Most crucially, she would serve as the visible reminder that Hadrianus intended to return, that this was a temporary campaign, not an abandonment of the throne, the first sign of serious trouble. "You retreat to the palace's inner chambers and wait for my return," Hadrianus insisted as they concluded their planning. "Promise me." "I promise to use wisdom," she replied, which was not quite the same thing, though neither of them pressed the distinction. 2 days later, as dawn painted the forum in shades of gold and crimson, Rome's legions prepared for departure. 25,000 men in perfect formation, their eagle standards catching the early light, their armor polished to mirror brightness. It was a display designed as much for political impact as military necessity, a reminder to any ambitious senators that the emperor commanded the loyalty of Rome's finest soldiers. From the balcony of the palace, Selvera watched the ceremony that would send her husband to war. The word felt strange in her thoughts. Husband. They had married quietly the night before, with only Torquatus and Livia as witnesses, speaking ancient vows by lamplight in a ceremony that was both deeply personal and utterly practical. "I take you as my wife," Hadrianus had said, his voice steady as he placed a simple gold ring on her finger. in good fortune and in hardship, in peace and in war, until death claims one of us. I take you as my husband," she had replied, surprising herself with how much she meant the words. "To stand beside you, to bear your children, to guard your legacy as you guard mine." Now, watching him address the assembled legions from his position atop the reviewing platform, she felt the full weight of what they had undertaken. This was no longer about survival or political convenience. They were bound together by vows and shared danger, by the growing affection that had surprised them both, and by the child she carried, a secret known only to them and the palace physician who had confirmed her pregnancy just days before. The irony was not lost on her that she had conceived the future of Rome while living under constant threat of death. But perhaps that was fitting for an empire built on conquest and maintained through controlled violence. "Citizens of Rome," Hadrianus's voice carried clearly across the forum, trained by years of addressing troops in the field. "Today we march to defend our borders against those who would challenge our strength. But we do not march in conquest, we march in protection of the peace that has blessed our city for a generation." The crowd's response was everything a politician could hope for. Cheers that echoed off marble buildings. Flowers thrown from upper windows, children lifted onto fathers' shoulders to catch a glimpse of their emperor. But Selvera's attention was caught by other details: the positions of senators' wives in the viewing stands, the placement of Praetorian guards throughout the crowd, the subtle signs of tension that suggested not everyone present wished the expedition's success. When the ceremony concluded and the legions began their march toward the city gates, Hadrianus climbed to the balcony where she waited. For a moment, they stood together in silence, watching 25,000 men disappear into the distance like a river of bronze and leather. "I'm trusting you with more than my throne," he said quietly. "I'm trusting you with my hope for the future, and I'm trusting you to come back alive," she replied, her hand moving instinctively to rest on her still flat belly. "We'll be waiting." His kiss was gentle but thorough, a promise sealed in the sight of any who might be watching from the forum below. When he stepped back, his expression carried the focused intensity she had learned to recognize when he shifted from husband to emperor. "Rule well," he said. And then he was gone, leaving her alone on a balcony above an empire that was now partly hers to govern. The first test of her new authority came before the sun reached its zenith. The wine cup arrived with the evening meal, its rim gleaming with an oily residue that caught the lamplight like a rainbow. Selvera had lifted it halfway to her lips before something, instinct perhaps, or the memory of her father's warnings about court dangers, made her pause and examine it more closely. "Claudia," she called to her serving girl, who stood arranging scrolls on the nearby table. "Where did this wine come from?" The young woman's face went pale. "From the imperial cellars, Domina, as always. Senator Lucius Flavius sent word that he had selected a particularly fine vintage in honor of your pregnancy announcement." The cup seemed to grow heavier in Selvera's hands. 3 weeks had passed since Hadrianus's departure, 3 weeks during which she had navigated the treacherous waters of Roman politics with growing confidence. The morning audiences had gone well, with citizens and minor officials praising her wisdom and fairness. The religious ceremonies had proceeded without incident, her visible presence reassuring the people that imperial authority remained strong. Even the Senate had begun to treat her with grudging respect, particularly after she had resolved a complex dispute over grain distribution that had been festering for months. But success, she was learning, bred its own dangers. "Did the senator deliver this personally?" she asked, setting the cup carefully on the table without drinking. "No, Domina. It came through the usual channels. The palace wine steward verified the seal and the vintage." Claudia moved closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Is something wrong?" Selvera studied the cup's contents more carefully. The wine itself appeared normal, a deep red that spoke of good grapes and proper aging. But that oily residue, almost invisible unless one looked for it, suggested something had been added after the wine was poured. "Summon Gaius Marcellus immediately," she commanded, "and tell no one else about this conversation." The palace physician arrived within minutes, his usually calm demeanor sharpening into professional alertness when he saw the untouched cup. Marcellus had been treating the imperial family for 15 years, long enough to recognize the signs of attempted poisoning. "Clever," he murmured, after examining the wine's surface with a small lens. "Not enough to kill outright. This appears designed to cause miscarriage while appearing to be natural complications from your condition." The words hit her like a physical blow. Not just an attempt on her life, but a calculated effort to destroy the child that represented Rome's future. "Can you identify the poison without tasting it?" "Difficult, but the residue suggests either hemlock extract or a preparation of pennyroyal, both known to cause bleeding in pregnant women." He set the cup aside carefully. "You would have appeared to suffer a tragic but natural loss, particularly given the stress of the emperor's absence." "How many people knew about my pregnancy?" "Officially? Only myself, you, and the emperor. But palace servants talk, and Senator Flavius has been remarkably well informed about palace affairs lately." Marcellus's expression darkened. "Someone in your household has been providing information to your enemies." The investigation that followed was conducted with the quiet efficiency that Torquatus had taught her to appreciate. Rather than dramatic confrontations or public accusations, they simply began observing more carefully, noting who had access to what information, tracking the flow of gossip through the palace's complex hierarchy of servants and attendants. The betrayal, when it was uncovered, came from an unexpected source: Marcus Cassius, the palace wine steward who had served the imperial household for over a decade. Under gentle questioning, enhanced by the threat of crucifixion for treason, he revealed a network of corruption that reached deep into the palace staff. "They promised me enough. Gold to buy a villa in Campania," he confessed, his voice shaking as he knelt before Selvera in her private study. "All I had to do was provide information about your daily routines, your meals, your visitors. I never meant for harm to come to you, Domina. I swear by Jupiter's lightning, but you knew harm would come to someone," she replied quietly. "You knew that information could only be used against the imperial family." The man's shoulders sagged with the weight of his guilt. "I have a daughter, Domina. She's sick, and the treatments are expensive. They offered hope, where I saw only despair. It was a story that repeated itself as they unraveled the conspiracy's local threads. Not grand political ambition, but small human weaknesses exploited by those with grander plans. A kitchen servant whose son was drowning in gambling debts. A guard whose mother needed surgery beyond his means. A scribe whose wife required medicines from distant Egypt. Flavius has been building this network for months," Selvera explained to the small council that governed in Hadrianus's absence. "Probably since before the assassination attempt. He's learned from his father's mistakes. Instead of relying on dramatic gestures, he's focused on patient infiltration." "What would you have us do?" asked Senator Marcus Crassus, whose loyalty to the imperial house had never wavered. "These are serious crimes, but the punishments traditionally demanded might create martyrs for his cause." Selvera had spent the previous night considering exactly this problem. Roman law was clear about the penalties for treason, but political wisdom sometimes demanded a more nuanced approach. "We'll make an example of Cassius," she decided. "Public execution for the wine steward who attempted to poison the imperial heir. But the others, the servants who provided information, they'll be given a choice. Exile from Rome with a small purse to start new lives elsewhere, or remaining to work off their debts in honest service to the state." "Mercy?" Crassus seemed surprised. "Strategy," she corrected. "Fear makes people desperate, and desperate people do foolish things. But hope makes them loyal. Let it be known that imperial justice can be tempered with compassion for those who show genuine remorse." The letters from Hadrianus arrived regularly, carried by fast riders who changed horses at staging posts along the military roads. His reports spoke of successful engagements with Germanic raiders, of tribes withdrawing deeper into their forests rather than face Roman discipline in open battle. But between the lines of official optimism, she could read his growing concern about the campaign's ultimate purpose. The barbarians fight like men who know exactly where we'll be and when, he had written in their personal code. Someone continues to supply them with information about our movements. The rot goes deeper than we imagined. Her own letters back were carefully crafted to provide encouragement without revealing the full extent of the dangers she faced in Rome. But in her most recent message, written after the poisoning attempt, she had allowed a hint of her own struggles to show through. The palace gardens bloom beautifully this season, though some of the older plants require careful tending to prevent disease from spreading to newer growth. Your gardener's wife sends her love and counts the days until your return. It was their agreed-upon way of saying that enemies were active but contained, that she remained safe and hopeful, and that their child continued to grow within her. But as autumn approached and the campaign showed no signs of ending, Selvera began to understand that survival was only the first challenge. The real test would be maintaining power and authority in an empire where pregnancy made her simultaneously more valuable and more vulnerable. The poisoned wine cup sat locked in her private safe, a reminder that her enemies were patient, creative, and utterly ruthless. But beside it lay something else, a letter from a grateful citizen whose petition she had granted, written in the careful script of someone newly literate, thanking her for justice fairly administered. Both represented the reality of her position, constant danger balanced against genuine opportunity to serve Rome's people well. The question was, which would prove stronger in the end? The hidden imperial seal was discovered by accident, tucked beneath a loose stone in the palace archives, while Selvera searched for records of grain distribution to the eastern provinces. What should have been routine administrative research became something far more profound when her fingers found the edge of an oiled leather pouch that had been concealed for nearly 2 decades. Seal itself was smaller than the one Hadrianus wore, but unmistakably imperial, carved with the eagle and thunderbolt that marked the highest authority in Rome. More intriguing still was the name engraved around its edge, Valerius Maximus Imperator, her father's name with a title he had never officially held. "This is impossible," she whispered, turning the seal over in her hands as late afternoon light slanted through the archive's high windows. "My father was never emperor, but the leather pouch contained more than just the seal. Carefully preserved documents written in her father's familiar hand told a story that reframed everything she thought she knew about her family's destruction and her own unlikely elevation. The first document was a letter from Emperor Antoninus, Hadrianus's predecessor, written in the final months of his life. "My friend, the burden I place upon you is heavier than any you have carried in 30 years of faithful service. The succession question grows more complex daily, and I find myself torn between duty to Rome and fear for what follows my death. Young Hadrianus has proven himself in war, but the Senate questions his legitimacy. Your bloodline, however, traces directly to Augustus himself through your grandmother's line, a fact we have kept carefully hidden for precisely such circumstances. Should events require it, you have my blessing to claim the purple. The sealed orders I leave with you explain how this transition might be accomplished with minimal bloodshed. But I pray to all the gods that such desperate measures never become necessary." Selvera's hands trembled as she read, understanding flooding through her like cold water. Her father had not just been a loyal general, he had been the secret heir to the imperial throne, held in reserve against the possibility that the main succession line might fail. The second document made the conspiracy against her family even more chilling. Report to Gaius Flavius Calvus regarding the Valerius situation. The bloodline threat has been neutralized through the attached evidence of supposed treason. Marcus Valerius Maximus chose death over revelation of the succession documents as anticipated. His wife and daughter have been dealt with according to your instructions. The imperial seal and related materials were not recovered from the residence. Marcus appears to have hidden them prior to his death. Recommend continued surveillance of any surviving family members. The daughter in particular showed concerning intelligence during her father's trial. If she survived the initial purge, she may pose future complications. The signature at the bottom belonged to Tribune Lucius Cornelius Sulla, one of the officers who had testified against her father at his trial, swearing he had seen the treasonous documents personally. But it was the third document that changed everything. A genealogical record tracing her mother's lineage back 5 generations to Julia, daughter of Emperor Augustus himself. Her claim to imperial blood was not just legitimate, it was stronger than Hadrianus's own. Sweet gods, she breathed, sinking into the wooden chair beside the archive table. They didn't just destroy my family to eliminate competition. They destroyed us because we were the rightful heirs. The sound of footsteps in the corridor outside made her quickly gather the documents and seal them back in their leather pouch. Whatever this revelation meant, it was too dangerous to leave exposed where curious servants or ambitious senators might discover it. That evening, she sat in her private chambers, staring at the evidence that reframed her entire life. Everything made terrible sense now. The sophisticated nature of the conspiracy against her father, the care with which her family had been systematically destroyed, even Hadrianus's seemingly random decision to save her from the streets. Had he known? Had their entire relationship been built on his awareness of her true bloodline? The thought brought a pain sharper than any physical wound. In the months since their marriage, she had come to believe that their growing affection was genuine, that what had begun as political necessity had evolved into something deeper. But if he had known her true identity all along— "You look troubled," came Hadrianus's voice from the doorway. She spun around, startled. He stood in travel-stained clothing, his face bearing the weathered look of a man who had spent weeks in military camps. "You're supposed to be campaigning beyond the Rhine." "I was, until dispatches reached me, suggesting that my wife needed my immediate attention." He moved into the room, his eyes taking in her obvious distress. "The Germanic tribes melted away into their forests 3 days ago, as if they had received word that their services were no longer required." "Curious timing, don't you think?" "You knew," she said quietly, her hand moving instinctively to the leather pouch beside her chair. "About my bloodline, about what my father really was." His expression didn't change, but she saw acknowledgement in his eyes. "I suspected. Your father's reaction to the treason charges was too extreme for a man who was merely loyal. Men don't choose death over exile unless they're protecting something more valuable than their own lives. So our entire relationship, everything between us, was built on a lie." "No!" He moved closer, his voice carrying absolute conviction. "It was built on necessity that became something real. Do you think I would have shared my bed with you, married you, entrusted you with governing Rome itself, if I saw you only as a political asset? Then why didn't you tell me?" "Because I needed you to choose our life together for its own merits, not because you felt obligated by bloodlines or political necessity." He knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his own. "And because I knew that once you learned the truth, everything would change." She studied his face, looking for deception and finding only the kind of weariness that came from carrying too many secrets for too long. "What changes now?" "Everything," he admitted. "Your pregnancy is no longer just about providing my heir. It's about uniting 2 imperial bloodlines in a way that makes your child's claim to the throne absolutely unassailable. But more than that, it means you're not just my consort. You're my equal in every way that matters." The implications crashed over her like storm waves. Flavius and his conspirators, they'll never accept this. If they were willing to destroy my family, to prevent my father from claiming the throne, what will they do when they learn I carry a child with an even stronger claim? "They'll do what cornered animals always do," Hadrianus replied grimly. "They'll make one final desperate attempt to eliminate the threat completely. Then we need to move first. Agreed, but carefully. If we act too hastily, we risk triggering the very civil war we've been trying to prevent. He stood and moved to the window, looking out over the city where thousands of Romans slept unaware that their empire's fate hung in the balance. There's something else you should know. The reason I returned wasn't just the Germanic withdrawal. I received word that Flavius has been in contact with provincial governors, particularly those commanding legions in Syria and Egypt. He's building military support for a coup. More than that, he's been spreading rumors that you've miscarried, that I've gone mad with grief and I'm unfit to rule. Some of the Eastern legions have already declared their intention to march on Rome to restore stability. Selvera felt the child move within her womb, as if responding to the danger that surrounded them. How long do we have? 2 months, perhaps 3, before winter makes large troop movements impossible. But Flavius won't wait for spring. He knows that by then your pregnancy will be too obvious to deny, and the child's birth would destroy all his carefully laid plans. Then we need to force his hand now. While we can control the circumstances, she stood, decision crystallizing in her mind with the clarity that desperate situations often provided. What if, instead of hiding my bloodline, we revealed it publicly? Let all of Rome know that their emperor's heir carries the blood of Augustus himself. That's incredibly dangerous. It makes you an even more valuable target. It also makes me harder to eliminate quietly. Flavius's power depends on operating from the shadows, on making his moves seem like necessary responses to imperial weakness. But if all of Rome knows I carry the rightful heir to the throne, any move against me becomes obvious treason. Hadrianus considered this, his strategic mind weighing risks and opportunities. It could work, but timing would be everything. We'd need to make the revelation in circumstances that maximize our advantage while minimizing his ability to respond. The festival of Jupiter in 3 weeks, she suggested. Maximum public attendance, religious significance that makes violence unthinkable, and enough ceremony to ensure our announcement reaches every corner of the empire. And if Flavius moves before then? She smiled, feeling for the first time in months like she was no longer simply reacting to events, but shaping them. Then he'll discover that the girl he helped make an orphan has learned a few things about strategy herself. The hidden seal lay between them on the table, its ancient authority suddenly transformed from burden to weapon. The game had changed completely, but perhaps that meant they could finally start winning it. Hadrianus's battle-worn gladius lay across the desk between them, its bronze hilt dark with years of use, its blade bearing the countless small nicks that spoke of real combat rather than ceremonial display. He had drawn it from its scabbard almost absently while they planned, the old soldier's habit of checking his weapons when preparing for battle. The Syrian legions crossed into Gaul yesterday, Torquatus reported, his voice tight with strain. 2 weeks had passed since the revelation in the archives, 2 weeks of careful preparation and growing tension as reports arrived of Flavius's accelerating timeline. 40,000 men under General Marcus Cassius Longinus, officially responding to reports of Germanic raids, but actually positioned to march on Rome within 10 days. Longinus, Hadrianus mused, testing the gladius's balance with practiced motions. I served with him in the East. Good soldier, ambitious but not without honor. What convinced him to support Flavius? Gold, promises of elevated command, and a carefully crafted story about your mental instability following your wife's supposed miscarriage. Selvera moved to the map that dominated the far wall, her pregnancy now visible enough to make that particular lie increasingly difficult to maintain. But more than that, he genuinely believes he's saving Rome from civil war by supporting the stronger claimant. The irony was bitter. By revealing her true bloodline to their closest allies, the inner circle who would need to support them publicly when the time came, they had created a secret too explosive to contain indefinitely. Somehow, word of her imperial ancestry had reached Flavius, transforming what should have been their greatest advantage into their most pressing vulnerability. He knows Livia had reported just that morning. Her usually composed demeanor cracked with worry. I saw it in his eyes when he spoke to the Senate yesterday. Flavius knows exactly who she is, and he's terrified. Terrified men make desperate choices, Hadrianus had replied, which was why they now found themselves planning for open conflict rather than political maneuvering. The festival of Jupiter was still 5 days away, but events were moving too quickly to wait for their preferred timeline. Flavius had called for an emergency session of the Senate, officially to address the barbarian threat, but actually to present his case for removing an allegedly unstable emperor. Meanwhile, his agents in the city had begun spreading rumors about Selvera, that she was a foreign spy, that her pregnancy was false, that her influence over Hadrianus proved his unfitness to rule. "We need to move tonight," Selvera said suddenly, her finger tracing supply routes on the map. "Before he can consolidate more support, before Longinus gets close enough to matter." "Move how?" Torquatus asked. "We can't simply arrest half the Senate without cause." "We don't arrest them," she replied, turning back to face the room. "We give them a choice. Public revelation of the conspiracy, complete with evidence of the plot against my family and proof of Flavius's treason, in exchange for exile rather than execution." Hadrianus looked up from his weapon inspection. "That's generous to men who've tried repeatedly to kill us. It's strategic. Dead martyrs inspire rebellion, living exiles serve as warnings." She moved to the desk, placing her hands flat on its surface as she leaned forward. "But more than that, it demonstrates that we're strong enough to be merciful. People remember that kind of justice." The plan they developed over the following hours was complex but elegant. Rather than waiting for Flavius to choose his moment, they would force the confrontation at a time and place of their choosing. The emergency Senate session he had called would become his trial, with evidence presented publicly and his fellow conspirators compelled to choose between loyalty to their cause or preservation of their own lives. "The Praetorian Guard?" Hadrianus asked as they refined the details. "Loyal," Torquatus confirmed. "I've spoken personally with every centurion. They understand that supporting Flavius means supporting the men who arranged the assassination attempt on you. The urban cohorts, split but leaning toward us. They respect strength, and Flavius has never commanded troops in the field. The people, they love a good drama," Selvera said with the first smile she had managed in days, "especially one where justice triumphs over corruption." But beneath the confident planning, she felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down like a physical burden. This was no longer about survival, or even about securing Hadrianus's throne. This was about fundamentally reshaping Rome's power structure, about revealing truths that would echo through generations. "Are you certain about this?" Hadrianus asked quietly as Torquatus stepped away to review guard deployments. "Once we reveal your bloodline publicly, there's no taking it back. You become a permanent target for anyone who dreams of imperial power. I became that target the day you found me on those temple steps," she replied. "At least this way, I'm a target who can fight back." The evening brought a steady stream of visitors to their private chambers, allies who needed final instructions, officers who required clarification of their roles, trusted servants who would carry messages to key supporters throughout the city. Each conversation was carefully managed, each person told only what they needed to know to play their part effectively. But it was the arrival of Gaius Marcellus, the palace physician, that brought the most crucial intelligence. "Flavius came to see me this afternoon," he reported quietly. "Officially to inquire about your health, but actually to fish for information about your pregnancy. He seemed particularly interested in the timing." "What did you tell him?" Selvera asked. "That patient confidentiality prevents me from discussing such matters with anyone except the imperial family." Marcellus paused, his expression troubled, but he didn't seem surprised by my refusal. In fact, he smiled when I mentioned confidentiality, as if he had expected exactly that response. The implication hung in the air like incense smoke. "He already knows," Hadrianus said grimly, "about the pregnancy's timing, about what it means for his timeline. which means he'll move tonight, Selvera concluded. Before we can reveal the truth publicly, the next hour was a blur of urgent activity. Messages dispatched to loyal commanders, guard rotations quietly adjusted, key supporters alerted to prepare for immediate action. The carefully planned public revelation was abandoned in favor of more immediate concerns, survival through the night, and protection of the evidence that could prove their claims, the archives, Torquatus said suddenly. If he moves against you tonight, his first target will be the documents that prove your bloodline. Without them, it becomes your word against his regarding imperial succession. Then we move them, Hadrianus decided. Everything goes to the inner vault tonight, along with the original imperial seal. As servants carefully transported the precious documents under heavy guard, Selvera found herself standing again at the window that overlooked the forum. Below, torches flickered in windows as Rome's citizens settled into evening routines, unaware that their empire's fate might be decided before dawn. Regrets? Hadrianus asked, joining her at the window. About which part? Marrying you, accepting this burden, or preparing to fight for a throne I never wanted? Any of it. All of it. She considered the question seriously, her hand resting on the curve of her belly, where their child grew stronger each day. I regret that my father died believing he had failed Rome. I regret that innocent people have suffered for the ambitions of corrupt men. I regret that our child will be born into a world where their very existence threatens the stability we're trying to preserve. But not the rest? No, she said firmly, not the rest. Whatever happens tonight, we'll face it together. That's worth any risk. The gladius caught moonlight as Hadrianus lifted it from the desk, checking its edge one final time before sliding it into the scabbard at his side. Tomorrow would bring either triumph or disaster, but tonight they still had each other, and the hope that justice might prevail over conspiracy. One more thing, he said, as they prepared to retire to chambers that might become a fortress before morning. Whatever happens, know that I love you. Not for your bloodline, not for political advantage, but for the woman who saved my life and chose to build something worth defending alongside me. The words settled around her like armor, providing strength for the battle ahead. Outside, Rome slept fitfully under a crescent moon, while in the shadows, enemies prepared to make their final play for power. But in the palace's inner chambers, an emperor and empress readied themselves for war. Their love forged strong enough to bear the weight of an empire's future. The golden eagle standard of the 12th Legion caught the first rays of dawn as it was carried through the Senate chamber doors, its presence transforming what should have been a political debate into something far more decisive. Behind it marched 50 Praetorian guards in full battle array, their armor polished to mirror brightness, their faces set with the grim determination of men who understood that Rome's future hung in the balance. Flavius had arrived early, as conspirators often do, hoping to control the morning's proceedings through careful positioning and prepared speeches. He sat in his traditional place among the senior senators, surrounded by his key supporters, their faces wearing the confident expressions of men who believed victory was assured. But as the eagle standard took its position at the chamber's heart, symbol of legitimate imperial authority, his confidence began to show hairline cracks. "Honored senators," Hadrianus began, his voice carrying the trained projection of a man accustomed to addressing troops across battlefields. "We gather this morning not for routine business, but to address a matter of treason that strikes at the very heart of our republic." The chamber erupted in carefully orchestrated outrage. "Treason!" shouted Marcus Brutus Calvus, rising from his seat with theatrical indignation. "The only treason I see is an unstable emperor's attack on the constitutional authority of this body." But Hadrianus was ready for such responses. From beneath his formal toga, he produced a scroll bearing the familiar seals of evidence, documents that had been carefully authenticated by Rome's finest legal scholars during the previous night's frantic preparations. I speak of the systematic murder of Marcus Valerius Maximus and the destruction of his family too. Eliminate legitimate opposition to those who would steal imperial power. His words rang off. Marble walls with absolute clarity. I speak of assassination attempts against the current emperor, of foreign gold used to arm barbarian tribes, of a conspiracy that reaches back more than 2 decades. Selvera entered the chamber at that moment, flanked by her own guard detail, her presence causing a ripple of surprised murmurs throughout the assembled senators. She wore the deep purple stola reserved for the highest-ranking women of the imperial family, her pregnancy now undeniably visible, her bearing carrying the quiet authority she had developed through months of governing in Hadrianus's absence. "Senators of Rome," she said, her voice pitched to carry to every corner of the chamber, "I stand before you as living proof of the conspiracy I will now reveal." What followed was a presentation that combined legal precision with political theater. Document after document was read aloud, each piece of evidence building a case that grew more damning with every revelation. The forged treason charges against her father, the bribery of witnesses during his trial, the systematic elimination of potential threats to Flavius's ambitions, but it was the revelation of her true bloodline that transformed the chamber's atmosphere completely. "This seal," she said, holding the ancient imperial signet high enough for all to see, "was entrusted to my father by Emperor Antoninus himself, along with documents establishing his legitimate claim to imperial succession through direct descent from Augustus Caesar." The silence that followed was absolute. Even Flavius's most loyal supporters seemed stunned by the magnitude of what they were hearing. Lies! Flavius finally found his voice, surging to his feet with desperation replacing his earlier confidence. Convenient fabrications designed to justify an illegal seizure of power. "Then let us test the truth," Hadrianus replied calmly. He gestured toward the chamber's entrance, where a figure in scholarly robes waited with obvious nervousness. Marcus Aemilius Scaurus, keeper of the imperial archives, has spent the night verifying these documents against records that have been sealed for generations. The elderly archivist stepped forward with trembling hands, his voice barely above a whisper as he addressed the assembly. "Honored senators, I have examined the genealogical records, the imperial seals, and the correspondence in question. By every test available to historical scholarship, these documents are authentic. Moreover," he continued, gaining strength as he spoke, "I have found additional evidence in the deepest archives, records that confirm the bloodline of Valerius. Maximus and his daughter extends directly to the divine Augustus through Julia's lineage." The political calculus in the chamber shifted visibly as senators absorbed the implications. This was no longer about choosing between competing claims to power. This was about acknowledging the restoration of Rome's legitimate imperial bloodline. But Flavius was not finished. "Even if these claims were true," he declared, his voice taking on the desperate edge of a cornered animal, "what does it matter? The woman stands before you heavy with child, clearly unfit for the rigors of imperial authority. And her husband has shown his weakness through his dependence on barbarian campaigns to maintain his position." It was exactly the opening Selvera had hoped for. She stepped forward, her hand resting protectively on her belly, her voice carrying the kind of quiet strength that made others listen without compulsion. "I carry the future of Rome within me," she said simply. "A child whose blood unites 2 imperial lines, whose claim to the purple will be unassailable by any reasonable measure. But more than that, I carry hope that Rome can be governed by wisdom rather than violence, by justice rather than conspiracy." The golden eagle standard seemed to catch more light as she spoke, its symbolic presence lending weight to her words. Around the chamber, faces that had been set in partisan lines began to show uncertainty, calculation, the first stirrings of what might become a change of allegiance. But in Flavius's section of the chamber, hands were moving toward concealed weapons, and eyes were exchanging signals that spoke of desperate measures about to be attempted. The newborn's first cry pierced through the chaos of clashing steel and shouted commands. a sound so pure and powerful that it momentarily silenced even the most determined combatants. In the antechamber behind the Senate floor, where Selvera had been rushed when her labor began during Flavius's desperate final gambit, that cry announced not just the arrival of a child, but the birth of Rome's undisputed future. The violence had erupted exactly as Hadrianus had predicted it would, with Flavius's supporters drawing concealed daggers in a last, suicidal attempt to eliminate the threats to their ambitions. But they had underestimated both the emperor's preparation and the Senate's reluctance to see their sacred chamber turned into a battlefield. Seize them! Senator Marcus Crassus had roared as the first blade was drawn, his own loyalty finally declaring itself in the moment of crisis. Around the chamber, the majority of senators, men who had been wavering between factions, suddenly found their courage and threw their support behind imperial authority rather than treasonous conspiracy. The Praetorian Guards had moved with lethal efficiency, their training evident in every precise thrust and parry. Flavius himself had managed only 3 steps toward the imperial section before Torquatus's sword found his heart, ending a conspiracy that had festered for decades in a matter of seconds. But it was the timing that would be remembered by historians, how the child's arrival coincided exactly with the elimination of the last serious threat to imperial stability, as if the gods themselves had chosen this moment to demonstrate their favor for the restored bloodline. A son, Gaius Marcellus announced, his voice carrying through the antechamber doorway to reach the Senate floor, where fighting had given way to an eerie calm. The Empress has delivered a son. Hadrianus stood over Flavius's body, his gladius still in hand but no longer needed, his chest heaving from exertion and emotion. Round the chamber, surviving conspirators knelt with their weapons cast aside, their faces showing the stunned realization that their cause had died with their leader. "Bring me to my wife," he commanded, and the authority in his voice brooked no debate. In the antechamber, Selvera lay exhausted but triumphant on the makeshift bed the palace servants had prepared. The child in her arms was small but vigorous, his cries having given way to the quiet alertness of a newborn examining his new world. When Hadrianus entered, still bearing the blood and dirt of combat, father and son regarded each other with the solemn intensity that marks such meetings. "He's perfect," Hadrianus whispered, his battle-hardened hands gentle as they traced the child's tiny features. "And he's safe. We're all safe now," Selvera replied, though her voice carried the exhaustion that comes after both physical and emotional ordeals. The conspiracy dies with Flavius, completely. His supporters either fled or surrendered when they saw him fall. The Senate is already calling for a formal recognition of your bloodline and the child's status as heir. He settled beside her on the narrow bed, careful not to disturb either mother or child. "It's over." But even as he spoke the words, both of them understood that endings were also beginnings. The child they had created would grow up not just as emperor, but as the living symbol of Rome's capacity for renewal, the proof that legitimate authority could triumph over corruption and conspiracy. From the Senate chamber beyond, voices rose in formal acclamation. "Hail Caesar! Hail the Empress! Hail the heir of Augustus!" The ancient rituals of imperial confirmation were being enacted with genuine enthusiasm rather than mere political necessity. "Listen to them," Selvera murmured, "shifting the baby so Hadrianus could hold him properly. They're not just accepting us, they're celebrating us." The child's eyes, startlingly alert for one so newly born, seemed to track the sound of the crowd's acclaim. Perhaps it was imagination, but both parents felt they saw recognition there, an understanding that he had been born not just to a family, but to a destiny that would shape the known world. "What will we call him?" Hadrianus asked, his voice soft with wonder at the small life cradled in his arms. "Marcus," Selvera replied without hesitation, "for my father, who died protecting the bloodline that flows in his veins." And Aurelius, for the golden age his reign will bring to Rome. Marcus Aurelius Caesar, Hadrianus repeated, testing the weight of the name that would one day command legions and reshape empires. It suits him. Outside, the crowds that had gathered upon hearing news of the Senate's emergency session were now celebrating with the spontaneous joy that marks truly momentous occasions. Wine flowed freely in the streets, flowers were thrown from upper windows, and children who would grow up during the new prince's reign danced in fountains while their parents wept with relief that civil war had been averted. The Golden Eagle standard, still standing in the Senate chamber, caught the light streaming through high windows, as if the gods themselves were blessing what had transpired. Around it, senators who had survived the morning's violence began the careful work of rebuilding consensus and planning for a future that suddenly seemed brighter than it had in decades. In the antechamber, a family held each other close while Rome celebrated outside. The child who would change the world slept peacefully in his father's arms, while his parents marveled at how far they had traveled from that rain-soaked night when desperation had brought them together. They had needed a home and an heir. Instead, they had found love, purpose, and the chance to give Rome something it had almost lost: hope for tomorrow. The family portrait commission arrived on a morning when spring light flooded the imperial gardens. Carried by an artist whose reputation for capturing not just faces, but souls, had made him the most sought-after painter in Rome. Marcus Aurelius, now 18 months old, sat on his mother's lap with the serious expression that had become his trademark, while Hadrianus stood behind them both with his hand resting protectively on Selvera's shoulder. "Hold still, young Caesar," the artist murmured with gentle humor as the toddler reached for the golden pendant at his mother's throat. Posterity wishes to remember this moment. It had been 2 years since that morning in the Senate chamber when conspiracy died and hope was born. 2 years during which Rome had prospered under joint rule that balanced Hadrianus's military expertise with Selvera's gift for administration and justice. The eastern provinces, once restive under corrupt governors, now sent tribute gladly along with reports of unprecedented peace. The Germanic tribes, deprived of the gold that had once bought their raids, had settled into productive trade relationships. Even the Senate, purged of its most corrupted members, had rediscovered the art of governance through debate rather than conspiracy. "He has your eyes," Hadrianus observed, watching their son's determined examination of everything within reach. "But your father's stubborn chin, and your complete inability to sit still," Selvera replied with the easy affection that had replaced their earlier careful politeness. "Yesterday, he climbed onto the desk in your study and tried to eat the Germanic treaties." The portrait session continued around such domestic observations, the artist working with practiced efficiency to capture not just their likenesses, but the genuine warmth that existed between them. This was no formal imperial propaganda, but a record of a family that had found happiness despite, or perhaps because of, the extraordinary circumstances that had brought them together. When young Marcus finally grew too restless to continue, Selvera carried him to the gardens, where his favorite nurse waited. The boy had developed a fascination with the olive trees that grew throughout the palace grounds, particularly the ancient specimens planted by Augustus himself. He would spend hours examining their gnarled branches and silver-green leaves, as if trying to understand his connection to the man whose blood flowed in his veins. "The Egyptian delegation arrives next week," Selvera mentioned as they walked among the trees, their conversation flowing naturally between personal observations and imperial business. "They're bringing the final tribute for the temple restoration, and the grain reports from Africa, better than expected. The new irrigation systems are producing surplus harvests." She paused to redirect Marcus away from a thorny rosebush, then continued without missing a beat. "I've been thinking we should establish a permanent grain reserve, enough to carry Rome through 2 bad harvest years." This was how they had learned to govern together. Not through formal councils and ceremonial meetings, but through the countless small decisions that accumulated into policy. Hadrianus handled military matters and foreign relations, while Selvera oversaw domestic administration and legal reforms. But increasingly, their areas of responsibility overlapped as their partnership deepened into true collaboration. The Syrian governors are requesting permission to expand the road network, Hadrianus said, settling onto a marble bench beside a fountain where Marcus could safely splash his hands in the water. They claim it's for commerce, but I suspect they're more interested in ensuring rapid troop movement if the Parthians become aggressive again. Approve it, Selvera advised without hesitation. Good roads serve both purposes, and prosperity makes rebellion less attractive than conquest makes it necessary. It was exactly this kind of practical wisdom that had won her the Senate's respect and the people's love. In public ceremonies, citizens would cheer for her almost as loudly as they did for Hadrianus, recognizing in her the kind of ruler who understood that imperial power meant responsibility rather than privilege. The afternoon brought its usual stream of petitions, reports, and administrative decisions. A dispute between merchants over shipping rights in the harbor. A request from provincial governors for additional funds to repair earthquake damage. A proposal from the Engineers Guild for a new aqueduct that would bring fresh water to the city's growing population. Each matter received their careful attention. Each decision made with consideration for its broader implications. This was the unglamorous reality of imperial rule, not grand military campaigns or dramatic political confrontations, but the patient work of keeping an empire functioning day by day. As evening approached and Marcus was settled with his nurse for his nightly routine, Hadrianus and Selvera found themselves alone in their private chambers for the first time since morning. The portrait artist had left behind preliminary sketches, and they studied these together with the satisfied air of people who had built something worth preserving. "Do you ever wonder," Selvera asked quietly, "what would have happened if you hadn't found me that night?" "Every day," Hadrianus admitted, "but not with regret, with gratitude. We needed each other, but we found so much more than either of us expected. And Marcus will inherit an empire stronger than the one we received. But more than that, he'll inherit the knowledge that legitimate authority comes from serving others rather than dominating them." Outside their window, Rome settled into evening peace. In the Forum, merchants secured their goods, while citizens hurried home to families and evening meals. On the 7 hills, lamps flickered to life in windows where ordinary people lived ordinary lives, their security protected by rulers who understood that imperial power existed to serve such simple happiness. The family portrait, when completed, would hang in the palace's main hall where visiting dignitaries and future generations could see it. But its true value lay not in artistic achievement or political symbolism. It captured a moment when love had triumphed over conspiracy, when two desperate people had found in each other the strength to build something lasting and good. In the garden below, the olive trees planted by Augustus whispered in the evening breeze, their ancient roots drawing strength from Roman soil, while their branches reached toward stars that would shine on the empire long after any individual reign ended. Some stories begin with kingdoms won through conquest. This one had begun with two people who needed each other and discovered they were stronger together than either could be alone. It was, perhaps, a better foundation for an empire than any sword could provide.